The summer of 1944 in occupied France was a season of mud, metal, and impossible decisions. For the men of the 6th Armored Division, every dawn brought the same grim reality. Another day of pushing through hedgerows, another day of watching good tanks become steel coffins because of something as simple as a severed fuel line. The sound that haunted their dreams wasn't the roar of German artillery or the whistle of incoming shells. It was the cough and sputter of a dying engine, followed by the terrible silence that meant you were sitting in 30 tons of immobilized metal while enemy guns zeroed in on your position. Staff Sergeant Mike "Bulldog" Morrison had been commanding Sherman tanks since North Africa, and he'd seen too many crews die not from direct hits, but from mechanical failures that left them helpless. His driver, Corporal Danny "Wrench" Kowalski, was a Detroit mechanic who could make any engine sing, but even he couldn't work miracles when shrapnel tore through the fuel system. Private First Class Tommy "Rabbit" Chen handled the radio with steady hands, despite being the youngest of the crew, while Sergeant Joe "Hammer" Rodriguez could put a 75mm shell through a barn door at 800 yards. Their loader, Private Billy "Southpaw" Jackson from Alabama, could feed shells into the breech faster than most men could blink. They called their Sherman "Iron Maiden," and she'd carried them through 3 major engagements without a scratch. But Morrison knew their luck was borrowed time. The German defenders were getting smarter, more desperate. They'd learned that American tanks had vulnerabilities beyond thick armor and big guns. A well-placed shot didn't need to penetrate the hull to kill a crew. Cut the right fuel line, damage the right component, and that Sherman became a sitting duck. The idea came to Morrison during a particularly brutal night in late July. They'd lost 2 tanks that day to mechanical failures under fire. Both crews had made it out alive, but barely. As Morrison lay in his bedroll listening to the distant rumble of artillery, he couldn't shake the image of those men scrambling out of their disabled tanks while German machine guns chattered in the darkness. There had to be a better way. "Wrench," Morrison called softly to his driver, who was tinkering with something under a tarp nearby. "Come here a minute." Kowalski crawled over, his hands still black with grease despite the late hour. "What's eating you, Sarge?" "Those fuel lines," Morrison said. "The ones that got hit today. What if we had a backup system, something the Krauts couldn't see, couldn't target?" Kowalski's eyes lit up with the kind of dangerous enthusiasm that Morrison had learned to both appreciate and fear. "You mean like a secondary feed? Run some extra lines from the auxiliary tanks?" "Something like that. But it would have to be completely off the books. Command finds out we're modifying Army equipment without authorization." Morrison let the sentence hang in the air. "Court-martial," Kowalski finished. "But if it keeps us alive?" The next morning brought orders to advance toward the village of St. Vith, where German resistance was expected to be fierce. Morrison gathered his crew around Iron Maiden as the pre-dawn mist clung to the hedgerows. The other tanks in their platoon were already warming their engines, the deep rumble of diesel motors creating a mechanical symphony that spoke of power and purpose. "Listen up," Morrison said, his voice low enough that only his crew could hear. "Wrench has an idea about our fuel system. It's not exactly regulation, but it might save our asses if we take a hit in the wrong place." Rodriguez spat into the dirt. "What kind of not exactly regulation are we talking about, Sarge?" Morrison looked each man in the eye. "The kind that could get us all hauled up in front of a tribunal if anyone finds out. But also the kind that might be the difference between going home and going home in a box." Chen, despite his youth, understood the implications immediately. "You're talking about field modifications without authorization. That's serious business." "Dead serious," Morrison agreed. "Which is why I'm not ordering anyone to go along with this. It's volunteer only. Anyone who wants out can request a transfer to another crew. No questions asked, no hard feelings." The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Jackson broke it with his slow Alabama drawl. "Hell, Sarge, we've come this far together. Might as well see how this story ends." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Morrison felt a mixture of pride and terror. He was about to lead his men into uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively. That night, while the rest of the division slept, Morrison and Kowalski worked by the light of a shielded flashlight inside Iron Maiden's engine compartment. The modification was elegant in its simplicity. Using spare fuel hoses liberated from damaged vehicles, they created a secondary feed system that bypassed the main fuel lines entirely. The auxiliary tanks, normally used only for extended operations, would now serve as an emergency backup that could keep the engine running even if the primary system was completely severed. "The beauty of it," Kowalski whispered as he tightened the last connection, "is that it's completely internal. No external lines for Jerry to spot and target. And if we never need it, nobody ever has to know it exists. Morrison tested the manual valve that would activate the system. It was positioned where Kowalski could reach it from the driver's seat, but it required a deliberate action to engage. No chance of accidental activation that might raise questions during routine maintenance. How long will it take to switch over if we need it? Morrison asked. Maybe 10 seconds if I'm ready for it. 30 if I'm not. But Sarge, Kowalski's voice carried a note of concern. This system isn't designed for sustained operation. It'll keep us running long enough to get out of trouble, but we can't rely on it for extended periods. How long is long enough? Maybe 20 minutes of normal operation. Less if we're pushing hard. Morrison nodded. 20 minutes could be a lifetime in combat. It was enough. The next 3 days passed in a blur of advance and contact. The German defenders were falling back, but they were making the Americans pay for every mile. Iron Maiden and her crew performed flawlessly, their illegal modification remaining their secret. Morrison began to wonder if they'd ever need to use it. The answer came on a gray morning when the mist hung low over the rolling hills east of St. Vith. Intelligence had reported German armor in the area, but the exact strength and position remained unknown. Morrison's platoon was tasked with reconnaissance in force, pushing up a narrow road that wound through dense forest on both sides. I don't like this, Rodriguez muttered from the gunner's position. Too many places for Jerry to hide. Morrison shared his gunner's unease. The road was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, with steep embankments rising on both sides. If they encountered resistance, there would be limited room to maneuver. But orders were orders. Keep your eyes peeled, Morrison told Chen. Any chatter on the radio about enemy contact, I want to know immediately. They'd been advancing for maybe 20 minutes when the world exploded around them. The first indication of trouble was the sharp crack of a high-velocity gun, followed immediately by the scream of a shell passing overhead. Morrison's training kicked in instantly. Contact front, traverse right. Rodriguez was already swinging the turret toward the source of the fire, but the enemy had chosen their position well. 3 German Panzers were hull down on the ridge above them, their long guns already trained on the narrow road. The lead American tank, commanded by Lieutenant Hayes, took a direct hit to the turret that sent smoke and flame billowing into the morning air. Reverse, get us some room, Morrison shouted to Kowalski, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was too late. The Germans had them bracketed, and the narrow road offered no escape route. The second shell hit Iron Maiden with a sound like the world's largest hammer striking an anvil. Morrison felt the tank shudder under the impact, but the armor held. Then came the sound he'd been dreading. The engine coughing, sputtering, fighting for life. Fuel lines hit, Kowalski called out, his voice tight with controlled panic. We're losing pressure fast. Morrison's mind raced through their options. They were sitting in a kill zone with limited mobility and a dying engine. In maybe 60 seconds they'd be completely helpless. Unless… Wrench! The backup system! Now! Kowalski's hands moved with practiced precision, reaching for the manual valve they'd installed 3 nights earlier. Morrison could hear the engine's death rattle growing louder, could feel Iron Maiden's power fading. Around them, the German guns continued their deadly work. Another American tank was burning, its crew bailing out under machine gun fire. Come on, Morrison whispered, not sure if he was talking to his driver, his tank, or whatever deity might be listening to desperate tank commanders. The valve clicked into position. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the engine caught, coughed once, and roared back to life with renewed vigor. The backup system was working. We're back in business, Kowalski shouted over the engine noise. But remember, we've got maybe 20 minutes. Morrison keyed his throat mic. Rodriguez, can you get a shot at those Panzers? Negative, Sarge. They're too well positioned. We need to move. And you? What would you have done in that cruise position so far? Faced with an impossible tactical situation, would you have risked everything on an unauthorized modification? Or would you have followed regulations and accepted whatever fate brought? Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, regardless of how long that might be. Instead of trying to reverse out of the kill zone, he ordered Kowalski to advance, not toward the German positions, but down a steep embankment that no sane tank commander would attempt under normal circumstances. You want me to what? Kowalski's voice cracked with disbelief. Down the hill, now! It's our only chance to get out of their line of fire. Iron Maiden tilted forward at an angle that made Morrison's stomach lurch. The Sherman wasn't designed for this kind of terrain, but their illegal fuel system was keeping the engine running when the original system would have failed completely. As they crashed through the underbrush, Morrison could hear branches scraping against the hull and the ominous groaning of metal under stress. "Sarge, we're going too fast," Jackson called out from the loader's position. "If we hit something solid—" "Hold on!" was all Morrison could manage as Iron Maiden careened down the hillside like a 30-ton toboggan. Through his periscope, he could see the German Panzers above them, their guns trying to track the wildly maneuvering Sherman. But the steep angle and dense vegetation made accurate fire nearly impossible. They hit the bottom of the ravine with a bone-jarring crash that threw every man in the crew against the steel walls of their compartment. For a moment, Morrison thought they'd broken something vital. Then Kowalski's voice came through the intercom, shaky but determined. "Engines still running, Sarge. We're mobile." Morrison quickly assessed their situation. They were in a narrow valley that ran roughly parallel to the road above. More importantly, they were now below and behind the German positions. The Panzers that had seemed so invincible from the road were now vulnerable to flanking fire. "Rodriguez, can you see the rear of those Panzers from here? Give me a second to get oriented." "Yeah, I've got a clear shot at the trailing tank. Range about 600 yards." "Take it." The 75mm gun spoke with authority, sending a high-explosive shell screaming toward the unsuspecting German tank. Morrison watched through his periscope as the round struck the Panzer's rear armor, penetrating the thinner plating and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The German tank erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions. The remaining two Panzers, suddenly aware that they were being engaged from an unexpected direction, began to traverse their turrets toward Iron Maiden's position. But Morrison's crew had the advantage of surprise and position. "Target the middle tank. Load armor piercing." Jackson slammed a fresh round into the breech with mechanical precision. Rodriguez adjusted his aim, leading the target slightly as the German tank tried to bring its gun to bear. The second shot was as accurate as the first, punching through the Panzer's side armor and silencing its gun forever. The third German tank, now alone and outflanked, made the smart decision to withdraw. Morrison watched it disappear over the ridge, trailing smoke from what looked like a damaged track. "Cease fire," Morrison ordered. "Chen, get on the radio. Tell command we've neutralized the German armor and are proceeding to rejoin the column." As the adrenaline began to fade, Morrison became aware of a new sound. The engine was running rough again. Kowalski's voice confirmed his fears. "Backup systems starting to fail, Sarge. We've got maybe 5 minutes before we're dead in the water." Morrison looked around the ravine, calculating distances and routes. They were maybe half a mile from the main road, with rough terrain between them and safety. 5 minutes might be enough, if they were lucky. "Can you get us back to the road?" "I can try, but it's going to be close." Iron Maiden clawed her way up the opposite slope, her engine coughing and sputtering as the improvised fuel system reached its limits. Morrison found himself holding his breath, as if that might somehow help their mechanical situation. Behind them, the two destroyed Panzers continued to burn, sending black smoke into the gray sky. They made it to the road with maybe 30 seconds to spare. As Kowalski shut down the backup system and attempted to repair the damaged primary fuel line, Morrison surveyed the aftermath of the engagement. 3 American tanks had been hit, but thanks to their unexpected flanking maneuver, casualties were lighter than they might have been. Lieutenant Hayes was wounded but alive, his crew shaken but intact. Thank you for staying with us through the most intense part of this story. But the most decisive moment is still to come as the crew faces the consequences of their unauthorized modification and the questions that will follow their impossible victory. The repair took Kowalski nearly an hour, working with spare parts cannibalized from one of the damaged American tanks. When he finally emerged from the engine compartment, his face was grim. "Primary systems back online," he reported. "But Sarge, that backup system saved our lives. Without it, we'd have been sitting ducks when that fuel line got hit." Morrison nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to the inevitable questions. How had they managed to keep their engine running when the fuel system was damaged? How had they been able to execute that desperate flanking maneuver? Sooner or later, someone was going to want answers. The questions came sooner than expected. That evening, as the division consolidated its positions around St. Vith, Morrison was summoned to a meeting with Colonel Patterson, the regimental commander. The colonel was a West Point graduate with a reputation for strict adherence to regulations, and Morrison felt his stomach tighten as he approached the command post. "Sergeant Morrison," Patterson began without preamble, "I've been reviewing the after-action reports from this morning's engagement. Your tank's performance was unusual." Morrison kept his expression neutral. "How so, sir?" "According to Lieutenant Hayes, Your tank took a hit that should have disabled your fuel system. Yet you continued to operate for another 20 minutes, long enough to execute a flanking maneuver that broke up the German position. I'm curious how that was possible. Morrison felt the weight of his crew's trust pressing down on him. He could tell the truth and face the consequences, or he could lie and hope the colonel didn't dig deeper. Either choice carried risks. Sir, Corporal Kowalski is an exceptional mechanic. He managed to jury-rig a temporary repair that kept us running long enough to complete the mission. Patterson studied Morrison's face for a long moment. A temporary repair. Under fire. In the middle of a tank battle. Yes, sir. That would be quite remarkable, Sergeant. Almost miraculous, one might say. Morrison said nothing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Finally, Patterson leaned back in his chair. Sergeant, I've been commanding tanks since the last war. I know what's possible and what isn't. What you accomplished today falls into the second category, unless... He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Unless what, sir? Unless you and your crew had prepared for exactly this kind of situation, which would suggest a level of foresight that goes beyond standard operating procedures. Morrison felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Sir, I'm not sure what you're implying. Patterson stood and walked to the map table, studying the tactical situation. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more thoughtful. Sergeant, in my experience, there are two kinds of soldiers. Those who follow orders exactly as written, and those who understand that sometimes the spirit of those orders matters more than the letter. The first kind are predictable, reliable, and often dead. The second kind win wars. Morrison remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. Your crew destroyed 2 German tanks today and saved American lives. How you accomplished that is less important to me than the fact that you did accomplish it. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. Good, because I'm recommending your crew for commendation. And Sergeant, whatever modifications you may or may not have made to your tank, I suggest you share that knowledge with the other crews in your platoon. Unofficially, of course. Morrison felt a wave of relief wash over him. Understood, sir. As he walked back to Iron Maiden, Morrison reflected on the day's events. They'd broken regulations, risked court-martial, and violated every principle of military discipline. They'd also saved lives and completed their mission against impossible odds. In the end, perhaps that was what mattered most. Kowalski was waiting for him by the tank, a knowing look in his eyes. How'd it go with the colonel? Better than expected. He wants us to share our expertise with the other crews. Unofficially? Very unofficially. Over the next several weeks, as the 6th Armored Division pushed deeper into German-held territory, a curious phenomenon began to occur. Tank crews throughout the regiment started reporting improved reliability under combat conditions. Fuel system failures, while still occurring, were no longer automatically fatal. Tanks that should have been immobilized continued to fight, continued to move, continued to bring their crews home alive. The official maintenance reports made no mention of unauthorized modifications. The unofficial network of tank mechanics and crew chiefs, however, buzzed with quiet conversations about backup systems, emergency procedures, and the kind of field expedients that weren't covered in any manual, but might save your life when everything else failed. Morrison never learned exactly how many crews adopted similar modifications, or how many lives were saved by the precedent his crew had set. What he did know was that Iron Maiden and her crew survived the war, fighting their way from the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Elbe River. They faced German armor, artillery, and infantry, but they never again found themselves helpless due to a severed fuel line. The backup system that Kowalski had designed in violation of every regulation remained their secret weapon, used sparingly but effectively whenever circumstances demanded. It became a symbol of something larger. The idea that sometimes survival required thinking beyond the manual, beyond the regulations, beyond the safe and approved methods that worked in peacetime but failed in the crucible of combat. Years later, when Morrison was asked about his war experiences, he would always return to that morning outside Saint-Vith. Not because of the tactical victory or the destroyed German tanks, but because of the moment when his crew had to choose between following orders and staying alive. They'd chosen survival, and in doing so, they discovered something fundamental about the nature of leadership, loyalty, and the bonds that hold men together when everything else falls apart. The war ended, as all wars do, with victory parades and homecoming celebrations. Iron Maiden was scrapped along with thousands of other Sherman tanks, her steel recycled into peacetime products. But the lessons learned in her cramped interior, The innovations born of desperation and implemented in defiance of regulations lived on in the memories of the men who'd served in her crew. Kowalski returned to Detroit and opened his own garage, where he became legendary for his ability to keep any engine running under any circumstances. Rodriguez used his GI Bill benefits to become an engineer, designing better armor systems for the next generation of American tanks. Chen parlayed his radio skills into a career in the emerging field of electronics, while Jackson returned to Alabama and raised a family on the farm his grandfather had started. Morrison stayed in the Army, eventually retiring as a colonel after serving in Korea and Vietnam. Throughout his career, he carried with him the memory of that desperate morning when an illegal fuel bypass had meant the difference between life and death. He never again commanded a tank crew, but he never forgot the lesson that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that can't be found in any manual. The story of Iron Maiden and her crew became part of the unofficial folklore of the armored forces, passed down through generations of tank commanders who understood that survival often depended on the willingness to think beyond the approved solutions. It was a reminder that in the end, wars are won not by perfect adherence to regulations, but by the courage to improvise, adapt, and overcome when the situation demands it. If you want more real stories of American tank crews and their improbable field modifications, consider subscribing to this channel, leaving your like, and commenting on what impressed you most about this operation. It really helps this type of content reach more people who appreciate the untold stories of the men who fought and won the Second World War through ingenuity, courage, and the kind of brotherhood that can only be forged in the crucible of combat.